When in 2013 the Social Progress Index was launched at a school forum, it was very clear that the consensus around GDP was breaking down. We have new challenges. We need new tools and new ways for measuring progress. I'm very honored to present and call to the stage Michael Green, the mind behind the Social Progress Index. Hi, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.
The stage is yours.
Elena, thank you very much, and to all the organizers and the supporters of this wonderful event. And good afternoon, buonasera, ladies and gentlemen. Isn't this a magnificent venue? That was, quite frankly, a bit rubbish. Yeah? I know it's the afternoon, it's hot outside, we've had lunch, we'd all like a little sleep. So I'm going to try that one again. I'm going to say, isn't this a wonderful venue? And then you have to say yes, but in your own language or any other language you like. So I want yeses in as many languages as possible, and then a round of applause, okay? So, isn't this a wonderful venue? Thank you so much. On the 4th of January, 1934, a young man presented a report to the United States Congress that 80 years on still shapes the lives of everyone in this room today. Still shapes the lives of everyone on this planet. That young man wasn't a politician. He wasn't a businessman. He wasn't a civil rights leader. He wasn't even a social entrepreneur. He was that most unlikely of heroes, an economist. His name was Simon Kuznets, and his report was titled National Income 1929 to 1932. Now, you might think that this report looks a bit dry, a bit boring. Well, I've read this report, and you'd be absolutely right. It is very dry, it is very dull. But this report is the foundation of how today every country measures its success, what we know best as gross domestic product, or GDP. GDP has defined and shaped our world for the last 50 years, and today I want to talk about a different way to measure the success of our societies that will hopefully define and shape our world for the next 50 years. But first, we have to understand how GDP came to this position of dominance. You see, Kuznets' report was commissioned in a moment of crisis, a time of crisis a bit like now. The crisis then was the Great Depression. After the Wall Street crash of 1929, the US economy was sliding into a deep, deep recession. And politicians and government leaders were really struggling to respond because they didn't really understand what was happening in the economy. They didn't have reliable and accurate statistics to guide their choices and decisions going forward. What Kuznets' report gave them, what Kuznets' statistics gave them, was reliable estimates about how much the US economy was producing, updated year by year. And armed with that information, they were able to find a way out of the Great Depression. GDP had proved that it was a useful tool, and so more and more countries started adopting this measure. And so today, every country in the world produces GDP statistics. Now, you'd think that Kuznets would have been very proud of his achievement, but he actually grew to hate it, because when he issued that first report, he issued a warning. On page 7, in the introduction to his report, he wrote, "The welfare of a nation can therefore scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income as defined above." It's not the greatest soundbite in the world. It is written by an economist. But the message is absolutely clear. GDP is a tool to help us manage our economies, not a way to measure the well-being or the success of our societies. But we have ignored Kuznets' warning. GDP does dominate our world. Markets move. Trillions of dollars flow across borders. Elections are won or lost based on whether GDP is going up or GDP is going down. We live in a world that is driven by GDP. But we know it's a flawed measure. GDP is blind to the environment. GDP thinks bombs and prisons are progress. GDP has nothing to say about fairness or community. Is it any surprise that our world is in such a mess if it's being driven by the engine of GDP? What I want to present to you today is a different way of looking at the world, a way of measuring the success of our societies based on the real things that matter to real people. And it's called the Social Progress Index. And I believe that we're ready for new ways to measure our societies in a way that we weren't 10 years ago. We're ready because the financial crisis of 2008 showed how far our fetish for economic growth can lead our societies astray. We're ready because it's incontrovertible that we're now hitting our planet's environmental limits. We're ready because we see even in affluent and successful economic societies, inequality and unfairness are ever greater issues. And we're ready because we can see that countries that could be economic superstars like Tunisia before the Arab Spring, in fact, were societies crumbling on the inside. The world is ready for a new form of measurement. The Social Progress Index defines what it means to be a good society based on 3 dimensions. The first is basic human needs. Does every member of society have the basic needs for survival? Food, water, shelter, safety. Second, foundations of well-being. Does every member of society have access to the building blocks of a better life? Education, information, health, and a sustainable environment. And then third, opportunity. Does every individual have a chance to pursue their hopes and dreams without barriers? Does everyone have rights, freedom of choice, freedom from discrimination, and access to the world's most advanced knowledge? So these 3 dimensions, these 12 components, we then measure with a set of 52 different indicators. And these indicators are all trying to measure outcomes. We're not measuring inputs. We're not measuring how much a country spends on healthcare. We're measuring the level of health a country achieves. We're not measuring whether countries pass laws against discrimination. We're measuring whether people experience discrimination. Now, the big thing to notice about these indicators and the index overall is that it has no economic indicators. There's no GDP or any other economic indicator in the model. And that makes it different from Human Development Index, OECD Better Life Index, Bhutanese Gross National Happiness, and so on, which tend to mix together economic and social indicators. Social Progress Index is based entirely on indicators of social and environmental outcomes. And what that means we can do is we can look at social progress relative to GDP per capita. So on this chart here, on the vertical axis, I've put social progress, higher is better. And on the horizontal axis, GDP per capita, further to your right, is better, okay? So, I don't have time to talk about the 133 countries we've been able to measure, but let me bring in a dot representing each one of them, and then put in the regression line that shows the average relationship between GDP and social progress. Now, first, a very important thing to notice here is that getting higher GDP is actually, on average, a good thing. Getting more GDP can really help social progress, which kind of makes sense. You think about poorer countries in particular, get a bit more GDP, you can build some more crucial infrastructure like roads and water supply, you can hire some more doctors and nurses, and so you can get a lot of social progress by getting a bit more economic resource to invest in social issues. And that's indeed the experience that we've seen in the last 15 years, with fast-growing emerging economies really lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, particularly where the right institutions and social investments have been made. And then we see the curve starts to flatten out. At a certain level of GDP, the easy wins have been taken, and it becomes harder issues that aren't so responsive to just getting more economic resources. And also, as you move further up that curve, as you get richer, you experience new problems, challenges of environmental sustainability, challenges of obesity and other health problems arising from being a richer society. So yes, GDP is overall, on average, good for helping advance social progress, but it's a relationship that changes over time, and crucially, isn't the whole story. Look at the noise around the trend line there. What this is demonstrating is that GDP is not destiny. At any level of GDP, there are opportunities for more social progress and risks of less. Let me illustrate. So here's Norway. So Norway is the country in the world with the highest social progress. It's also got a lot of GDP. If you look for comparison, here's New Zealand. New Zealand has almost the same level of social progress as Norway, but with a much lower level of GDP per capita. We can look at the other end of the scale. Here's Central African Republic, which is our lowest ranked country on social progress. But it's not just GDP that's holding Central African Republic back. Here's Malawi. Malawi is not that much richer than Central African Republic, but it has a much higher level of social progress. One of the global superstars at creating social progress out of its GDP, in fact, is Costa Rica. So here's Costa Rica, very, very high level of social progress relative to its GDP, and I'm afraid to say, higher than Italy. So a remarkable achievement by Costa Rica. So by being able to pull apart economic development and social progress, we can start to look into the relationship between the two. And we can also demonstrate empirically that if your country, your society has a development plan based entirely on economic development, you don't have a complete development plan. And that's the message we've been taking around the world in the last few years. And now we're working with governments at the national level, city level, state level, even local communities to help them to integrate those indicators and start coming up with more holistic development plans for economic development and for social progress. And I will be talking more about this on a panel tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. And yes, that was a shameless plug. But rather than talking about that, since we're at a world forum, I thought we should take a look at how our world is doing. Because we've measured 133 countries, so we've got 95% of the world's population covered by the Social Progress Index. So we can add up all those different country results, weighting the results, of course, by country population. So China obviously has a much bigger weight in the calculation than, say, Iceland, to come up with a measure of how the world is doing on social progress. And here's how we're doing. So we've got social progress here on the vertical axis, 0 to 100. So let me just say the scale is 100 is a country that would score the maximum on every indicator. So no country has got to 100 yet. 0 would be a country that scored worst on every single indicator. And the world as a whole scores 61, which, to be honest, doesn't mean a lot. But think of it this way. The average human being is living at a level of social progress somewhere between the people of Cuba and Kazakhstan. But more importantly, what we see is that the pattern of social progress is very different across the 12 components of the model. And let me highlight a few of those now. Maybe starting with some good news. Here's how the world is performing on, first of all, nutrition and basic medical care. That's the first one that's highlighted. And the second one is access to basic knowledge, so primary and secondary education. And here we see the world is scoring best of all the components, and is over 80, pushing towards 90 perhaps. And these are areas, of course, that were a focus for the Millennium Development Goals. And I think this really shows how when the world can focus effort from all stakeholders of all sectors to try and come up with solutions, then we really can make progress. Now, there's work still to be done. It is still, frankly, a disgrace that people go hungry in this world, that people are dying of preventable diseases, that kids aren't going to school. But this does show that we can make progress, and it is achievable, it is possible to dream of a world where no child goes to bed hungry. So those are two areas under the Millennium Development Goals where we seem to have done pretty well. More disappointing is water and sanitation. And this I find very paradoxical, because water and sanitation, we see at the level of individual countries that many countries achieve the 100 maximum score, even at relatively low levels of GDP. Water and sanitation is a solvable problem, but we seem to have not been able to focus the resources on getting water and sanitation addressed so much as those other issues. So that seems like a priority area. So there's the areas we've been doing well that have been part of the whole Millennium Development Goals process. Where are we doing less well? Well, it's these two areas over here. First of all, personal rights, and then secondly, tolerance and inclusion. Now, in a way, these haven't been global priorities for development. Often they get left out of global development frameworks, perhaps why these scores are low. What we also know is that some countries have prioritized economic development over personal rights, so that's why we see quite a low score there. We also know that countries across the income scale suffer from issues around tolerance and inclusion. Even the richer societies can have real problems with discrimination. So we see the lowest score overall there. So in a way, it takes a different frame on the world's challenges. And these issues that often get neglected are actually really serious areas of deficit for the world. Now, environmental sustainability. Now, this is an interesting one. It's not the worst performing component, but it's not great either. And my message would be, we should be very worried. Because what we also can tell from the data is that actually environmental performance tends to improve little as countries get richer and often deteriorates. So it may be that as more countries get richer, as more countries start emitting greater greenhouse gases, making more demands on our water resources, destroying more of our biodiversity, we may see this score on ecosystem sustainability starting to go down over time. The world could start going backwards on this aspect of social progress. The same is true of another one, more surprising component of the model, which is health and wellness. Health and wellness has a very strange and interesting relationship with GDP per capita. We see that health and wellness, which is measuring things like early deaths from non-communicable diseases, obesity, air pollution-related deaths, and mental health, really doesn't improve with GDP per capita. It's a problem that we have seen to be really struggling to solve, particularly as greater wealth brings new problems such as obesity. So if we were trying to say, are there two areas where the world really desperately needs solutions, where certainly the economic development model isn't working, I would definitely highlight these as two key areas. Overall, this is a snapshot of where our model of economic development has taken us. There's some good, there's some not so good, and there's some bad. And if we really are going to push on in the 21st century and really start making progress on all these dimensions, the message is clear. Business as usual is not enough. We need new ideas, new institutions, new solutions to solve the world's most pressing problems. We need social entrepreneurs. We need you. Let's get to work. Thank you.